Nick, I mean, I think that's such a perfect tee up to our next guest, especially given, you know, the sort of ramifications that we've had with the last few cyber attacks. I mean, we've had this one that Sue talked about, the dark side attack on critical infrastructure. We also had an attack earlier this year in Florida on a water treatment facility. I mean, things are getting closer to what we've kind of been dreading for years and wringing our hands over how are we going to deal with these type of things.
Sure. Well, I guess it'll be interesting to talk to David now about red lines. We talked about red lines yesterday in a slightly different context, but I guess it's the same thing. It's about how we deal with competitors, how we use deterrence, and you know, how they handle deterrence in the other direction. So I think red lines is an important theme, and clearly important in the cyberspace, which, as Sue demonstrated, is an area that's still got lots of nasty surprises for us. So it's going to be good to talk to David about this now.
I totally agree with you. So let me give a proper introduction to one of the people following at least this latest story very closely, is New York Times correspondent David Sanger. He's also double dutying these days as a White House correspondent. David is also the author of a book. It's a great book called The Perfect Weapon. It's one of my favorite books on how the world really needs to wake up to cyber vulnerabilities. So we're not going to be able to say we didn't know this was coming. David, are you with us? I see he's connected, so we're going to give him a quick second to turn on his camera and his microphone here. And if you haven't seen his reporting also, there are a couple of great pieces he has done this week with his team at the New York Times that I suggest you Google, because they always give you a little bit more insight and context.
Are you able to hear me?
Hi, David, we can hear you now. Welcome.
Great, and can you see me?
We cannot see you yet.
Oh, let's see if we can make this work. Okay. There we go. All right. I think you now ought to be able to see me and hear me. Can you?
I still don't have your camera yet, but we are able to hear you.
Okay, hold on just one sec.
No problem.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yep.
And can you see me?
Not quite. Oh, I see your cam. There you are. Okay, we've got both now. Look at this.
All right.
We're technological geniuses.
Cyber reporter, and I mean, if Sue can do this from a car, you would think I would be able to do this from my desk, but the wonders of GoToWebinar. Sorry for that run, but I heard the last part of your conversation with Sue, and it reminded me why you should never agree to speak at something after Sue Gordon.
Well, she's very bright, but so are you, David. You've been following this issue for a very long time, closely this latest hack. I mentioned the fantastic book that you had written on what has become the perfect weapon and the need for society and government to wake up to some of the threats. And it feels like this week, the US is seeing a further escalation of some of these things that we knew were possible. How do you characterize this dark side attack this week, and what are your big takeaways so far?
Well, we did know it was possible, and as Sue reminded us, we've thought a lot in the past about critical infrastructure. The thing is, we haven't quite thought about it the way it actually happened, which is, of course, what always happens, right? But how have we thought about it in the past, Suzanne? We've thought about a big nation state coming in, Russia, China, Iran, and turning off all the power from Boston to Washington or Seattle to LA in, you know, what politicians would call the cyber Pearl Harbor, because it was the best way to get Congress's attention and get some money. When it happened, it didn't look anything like any of those simulations. It wasn't a nation state. It was a ransomware group. It wasn't a ransomware group that was intending to turn off the pipeline. They were just going in to get ransom, right? So they lock up the information technology side of the company, as Sue pointed out. And we would all say, oh, no problem, because all companies segregate the information technology side from the operational technology side. So even if you're into the business records, that doesn't mean that you can control the pipeline, which was a great theory if it was right, but it turned out not to be right. It's not that you could control the pipeline from the information technology side. It's that you couldn't run the pipeline without the information technology side. So everything that Colonial did to make sure that, you know, this amount of gasoline was flowing through the pipeline from the Gulf up to New York and into like a Shell facility or something like that, was dependent on software that assumed that it could monitor the flow, that it could bill the right place for it all. And so that means that there is, at least through some kind of permeable barrier, information flow between the information side and the operational side. And the fear that they had at Colonial was that they didn't understand the malware, that maybe it could flow through that. It's entirely possible to do a ransomware attack against physical infrastructure. So they shut it down. And when they shut it down, it's not as if they shut it down with the approval of the US government or some regulatory agency. They made the decision quickly with the help of FireEye, I think, they called in. And then all of a sudden, people begin discovering the second order effects. That if it's not flowing after a few days, there's some modest shortages in some places, and people panic and they start filling up and they empty out the gas stations, and the gas stations can't refill. And then all of a sudden, you've got a full-blown crisis. So, yeah, there are a lot of lessons for us to learn. But you know what else? There are a lot of lessons for China, Russia, Iran, and every other ransomware group to learn, because they've just discovered that they don't actually have to go after the physical infrastructure to take us out. They can do what ransomware people do and probably have almost as disruptive an effect.
I think, you know, one of the things that I worry about is, and I think about a lot, is red lines. And that's what we were, you know, very eager to talk to you about today. I mean, we keep talking about red lines. Governments are very cautious, as we've heard, you know, earlier this week, to impose any sort of pain point that they're open and transparent about against groups that they know are responsible for attacks like these, because they're worried about what's going to come after that, right? The next step. But David, I mean, at some point, it feels like there has to be an open and transparent sort of foot down approach, or this is going to continue, because we've seen these attacks, these type of attacks continue without that. So let me get your thoughts a little bit on red lines and what needs to happen and how alliances can work together to enforce red lines.
Well, getting alliances to enforce red lines is difficult because everybody places the red line in a different place, because you're vulnerable to that response to the red line. And that's really what worries them. So think about some red line experiences that we have had in recent times. President Obama set a red line for the Syrian president, Bashar Assad, that suggesting we would take military action if he used gas against his own people. And when he did, and it clearly passed the red line, that posed Obama with a huge problem, one that he decided in the end, you know, he could strike back, but it probably wouldn't have a lasting impact. And so he ended up wanting to kick it to Congress, and Congress, of course, in the end, didn't take it up. We've set red lines for Iran prior to the 2015 nuclear deal of each thing that they could not go do, either we have or the Israelis have. And Graham Allison has a great chart that we use in our course at Harvard on this, in which he shows the red line and then what happened when the Iranians passed it, and then we set up a new red line, and then the Iranians passed that and all that. So the reason governments don't like red lines is that they actually force a decision point. And in cyber, they have a particular danger, which is that everybody calibrates their attack to be just south of your red line in hopes that it won't result in a military conclusion. So let's think about that in the Colonial case. Well, first of all, we usually establish red lines against countries, but this is against a ransomware group that's all over the place, Eastern Europe, maybe some in Russia. Well, you know, ransomware is the ultimate work from home job, Suzanne. So, you know, it's not as if there's like one place that you would go take out. That's number one. Number two problem in the colonial case for red lines, in my view, is that because this was so subtle and because it was intended mostly as a criminal act against the information technology side, it's not exactly like somebody planted a bomb along the pipeline, right? Mm-hmm. If a terror group had gone and blown up the pipeline outside of Atlanta, mm-hmm. and you could turn on CNN and you'd see gasoline flowing and flames every place because something got set off and all that, the call for a military response would be extraordinarily high. Okay, if you accomplish the same result, interrupting the pipeline, but you do it without the flames and without the explosion, then all of a sudden we're saying, well, it's a criminal case. We really got to get the Justice Department to, ramp up on ransomware, which they announced a few weeks ago they were doing before this happened, and so forth. And we're caught in this netherland between what's criminal activity and what's an activity that would result in a kinetic state response. We had this problem in Sony. We had it with the Sands Casino. I play this all out not only in the book but in the HBO documentary, where we sort of take you to each of these locations and then the Situation Room debate. And those debates are all about red lines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great point.
So are you saying, David, very good to see you, by the way.
You, Nick.
Are you saying that red lines are a waste of time then? What are you actually saying? How should red lines function? Because I've always thought the value in cyber is that if some organization or state goes so far and paralyzes people's ability to take money out of the ATMs in the UK, the reaction is going to be so strong it's not worth their while doing it. Are you saying this kind of mutually assured destruction just doesn't work in this space?
It sure doesn't. One of the big lessons about cyber deterrence is that all of the questions, Nick, that come up in nuclear deterrence are the same, and all the answers are different, right? Because in the nuclear age, we had the advantage that we had a very small number of adversaries. We knew exactly where they were. They had assets we could hold at risk, right? And so, and you could go into a big cave in Colorado Springs and see exactly where the attack came from. None of those things are the case in cyber. In cyber, the weapon is in the hands of states. It's clearly in the hands of criminal groups, ransomware groups in this case. It's in the hands of terror groups. They haven't used it terribly effectively. And it's in the hands of teenagers. And we all know about what it's like to deter teenagers, right? So that means that you don't have a clear retaliatory target set. And while Sue made the right point that somebody harbors a ransomware group, the problem that Biden faces right now is that everyone may harbor dark side. They're in Russia, they're elsewhere in Eastern Europe. It's not like there is one place. We don't bomb countries that harbor drug gangs, right? We go after the drug gang, but we don't necessarily pose a military threat to the country that is harboring them. We did go into Afghanistan because the Taliban were harboring Al Qaeda. But let's face it, we're not going to retaliate against the Russians because of a ransomware group whose presence they may tolerate, but who we don't think was acting on behalf of the FSB. I mean, we took only relatively modest sanctions action against the Russians for SolarWinds, which was a direct activity of Russian intelligence.
Right. So does that mean our response can only be defensive? I mean, normally in a different world, we'd say, okay, you guys are harboring this nasty group, and can you please hand them over to us or take some action or whatever it is? Obviously, the Russians or whoever it is have the ability of denying any knowledge of these and, default mode, just lying barefacedly about the whole thing. So it sounds to me as if our offensive options in response to something like DarkSide don't really exist. All we can do is try and protect our own infrastructure, or do we have offensive options against them?
I think we do. So we had an interesting example last year. There was another Russian ransomware group called TrickBot. And the fear last September and October was that since they rent out their facilities to anybody who wants it, that they would rent it out to somebody who wanted to get into the election infrastructure, right? That all they would have to do is go freeze up a bunch of precincts and keep people from voting. And, you could imagine then that Donald Trump's, claims of a rigged election, which are completely baseless now, but they wouldn't have been baseless necessarily if there had been a foreign effort to lock up data the way we saw it locked up here. So Cyber Command, with some help from the NSA, went in and basically disabled the TrickBot infrastructure for a good number of weeks. And they got a lot of help from Microsoft, which was able, through a legal process, to go dismantle some of their infrastructure. I would not be shocked if you saw Cyber Command and the NSA unleashed, maybe they have been already, on the infrastructure around DarkSide. And in fact, it's pretty clear from reading the statements that DarkSide's put on its own website about how it's going to start moderating how its tools are being used by others, that it suddenly realizes it bit off more than it can chew. And I think they're worried that they are suddenly going to become a target. And remember, if you're a ransomware group, you want to fly in under the radar. You don't want to be the big target of a state. You want to go, you got a business enterprise to go do here. You got money to go be made. And, you don't want to have to be going to bed at night wondering if Paul Nakasoni's forces are coming after you, right? So they've made a big mistake here. And I wouldn't be shocked if DarkSide dissolved and re-emerged in some other form at some point in the future, because they are really in the crosshairs at this point. And that's where the U.S. wants to go keep them. So we need two kinds of deterrence. We need the defend forward stuff, the hunting for these groups to act preemptively, which is hard because it means going into another country's networks. But we also need much greater resilience. And I thought one of the big lessons this week was we didn't have as much resilience as we thought. It was taking far too long to get trucks, trains, ships, whatever, to be able to do what that pipeline did.
Mm-hmm. Let me follow up just quickly on Nick's question with you, David, with a question from Dan Freeman, who's writing in. He says, in the context of Red Lines discussion, what do you think about recent UK announcement of the National Cyber Force that will conduct offensive operations against hostile state actors, terrorists, and serious organized criminals? How would this change the international landscape and future NATO and Five Eyes alliance approach? And do you think other countries will follow?
It's interesting. Britain's kind of following. That's kind of the model of U.S. Cyber Command right now, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, everybody's building their own version of Cyber Command. Now, it might have different ways of talking about going in preemptively. Now, the British have always been, and Nick, you can be interested in your thoughts on this as well. They've always been a little bit modest about their capabilities. Remember, it's the British who found the Russian group that was coming in to get into the Democratic National Committee in 2016. The British have always been well plugged in to Russian operations. The British have done more preemptive cyber operations than they have let on. It's just because of the Official Secrets Act, we don't hear about a lot of it until much later, if we hear about it at all. So I just thought that what they were doing was sort of taking more out into the open, which I think you need to do, their capability, which is part of their deterrent effect. I mean, you're going to think hard when you think about attacking a country that has an up and running cyber command that's willing to fry your servers than one that doesn't.
So what's the next scenario that we see coming? We saw years ago in the attack against Target, the entry through a third party player, actor in that case.
System and got to the retail system. That was pretty cool.
Exactly. And now we've seen a criminal group hack, a facility where we didn't think that the facility itself might take this much of an action, but did. I mean, you mentioned we didn't see this coming. You think about this stuff all the time, David. What's the next thing we're not going to see coming?
So what we saw in the Colonial thing was the ultimate blended threat, right? Where you've got a national security event that grew out of what was essentially a criminal act. So if you are a state actor right now, you are suddenly worried about whether or not you're suddenly worried about whether or not you really want to go attack directly, until somebody comes along and says, well, why not hire the next dark side? Make the other side think that this is merely criminal. It gives us additional cover. And when you think about it, the North Koreans have been doing this for years with groups that they hire out to go after cryptocurrencies and federal, reserve banks and, central banks around the world, mostly to steal money. The Iranians have done a pretty good job of this. So I think what you're going to begin to see is the United States having to decide whether or not that it wants to begin to treat ransomware groups the way it treats state actors, or whether they want to keep that segregated off in the Justice Department and treat it as a criminal case. And, it's very much like the issue we were facing before and after 9/11 with terrorist groups. Would you try to go seek to indict them and arrest them and bring them to the U.S. for trial? Or do you go take preemptive action? And it's actually the terror models, I think, that in some ways are going to guide the way people begin to think about ransomware, particularly against critical infrastructure.
I couldn't agree with that more.
Can I just come in, Suzanne? So, I mean, one thing that's fascinated me and worried me for a long time, David, has been terrorists making use of, more sophisticated capabilities. And I mean, recently in the UK, they just picked up a carving knife and chased after somebody on London Bridge, which actually does do a surprising amount of damage to our morale and even our economy. I've always been worried about terrorist groups, including state-sponsored terrorist groups, doing something smarter than that, which is a really destructive, for example, a really destructive cyber attack. Do you think the world is closer to that than we have ever been before?
I'm shocked it happened already.
How close are we?
Yeah.
Well, we certainly are. I mean, as Sue said at the end of her drive and talk, the technology is everywhere and available to everyone. And that's pretty significant, because if it's available to everyone, it's available to state actors, but also to these groups that the state actors could hire out. Now, in the Colonial case, so far, we have zero evidence that they were acting on behalf of the state. And yet it was interesting that President Biden said on Monday or Tuesday, he's going to have to take this up with Putin. Now, you know what Putin's going to say. Putin's going to say, oh, these, kids who run these cyber operations, they're a problem around the world. You have them too, right? And so he's going to use it to go deflect responsibility. SolarWinds is a different case because it came straight out of the Russian intelligence. And we haven't heard from the administration on hafnium. And that was another, think about the 3 different examples that we've had just in the past 6 months. In SolarWinds, you have a highly sophisticated operation run by an intelligence agency to basically put code into a company's software that they knew would be downloaded throughout corporate America and the federal government and infected. In Hafnium, we have the Chinese going after some flaws that they didn't create. They were Microsoft's fault, but they exploited it to get into these Microsoft Exchange systems. And in Colonial, we have a standard ransomware attack that wasn't intended to flow across to the operational side, but it had that unintended effect.
Mm-hmm.
We've only punished one of these, SolarWinds, and we can argue about how effective that message was sent, right? Hafnium, there's been no response, and we haven't seen yet what the response is going to be on Colonial.
Governments argue a lot that there may be responses they just don't want to talk about, which I think from a reporter's perspective sounds a little bit like a smokescreen. At some point, there has to be better communication about what governments are doing to engage this. So we talk about transparency all day long, but if there's not a clear message being sent to these groups, are they just ineffective?
So I have this argument all the time with my friends in government. So in the course of responding to SolarWinds, they said there will be seen and unseen, and the seen part was the sanctions, and the unseen thing may have happened already, may not have, maybe in the future, but it's unseen. And my argument is, if you're really trying to establish some red lines around the world, what good is unseen? Yeah, Putin might know what you did to him, but you want the Chinese to know too, and you want the Iranians to know, and the North Koreans to know, and the leaders of every ransomware group to know, because you want them to see the size of the penalty. Now, the argument they make back is, don't worry, they'll know. Their intelligence services will figure it out. I'm not sure I'm persuaded by that. And so I would argue that, in fact, you want this to be highly public.
Mm-hmm.
Now, am I self-interested in that? I'm a journalist, like you, Suzanne. We want to know about it so we can write about it, so we can analyze it, so we can criticize it, so we can, explain how it could have done better. Okay, I get that, and I understand their suspicion. Mm-hmm. But, we're kind of back to that great scene in Dr. Strangelove, where at the end of the movie they say, if no one knows about the gadget, what good is it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where we are.
I feel like there's a portion of people, though, which is the public, which is becoming more and more the victims of disinformation campaigns, of nation states driving efforts to divide people. So I feel like there's coming a time when, if the government isn't more transparent with the people about what they're doing, and something happens, there is going to be a backlash against whatever government it is that's in office at that time as well. And that leads to a question from someone who did not give their name, but who says the majority of Americans are still oblivious to all of the finer points of some of the things that you've been talking about, David. How important is it for these issues to become more widely understood among the civilian populations who are often finding themselves the victims of these hacks in one way or another?
It obviously, question answers itself. They've got to understand it better. In that regard, we may owe DarkSide a huge vote of thanks here, because there's nothing like, a few days of gas lines to make people actually think about supply chain vulnerabilities. I've been a believer for a long time that we need to explain this stuff. That's why I take the time to go do the books, and more importantly, in some ways, the documentaries, because wonderful as your bookcase behind you is, and I know, Suzanne, that you are a great consumer, and I see the perfect weapon sitting right behind you back there. Very good product placement.
Alphabetical order, no bias.
But the fact of the matter is that you get to more people through the medium. You got to meet people where they are, and that's why we did the HBO doc, right? Because we had some really vivid hacks to go look at, and boy, if we had had this one, by that time, the pictures of those gas lines, I think, would have really driven it home as well.
I'm going to give Nick the pleasure of asking a final question, and I'm going to give him a moment to come up with one. While I want to get your thoughts, David, on the just from the purely kind of U.S. perspective, the team that the Biden administration is now putting into place to handle cyber is different, not only to team members, but the way that this organization is structuring this administration on cyber is a little bit different from under the Trump organization. What are the positives that you see so far, and where are areas where you may see, from a journalist perspective, gaps?
So overall, it's a vast improvement. I mean, you know, they have created a deputy national security advisor for cyber and emerging technologies. That's Ann Neuberger, who's well known to all of us, and for her work at the NSA and elsewhere. She had a very talented team underneath her. We now have a new appointed but not yet in place and congressionally appointed national cyber director in Chris Inglis. Jen Easterly is coming back into government to run the DHS side of this. So it's a very talented team. Just the amount of attention that they have spent on this every day, the White House briefing in the morning has started with this hack. The president is speaking on this at 11:50 this morning, because I assumed, Suzanne, that you would arrange that as sort of a closing.
I thought it would be,
yeah, that was good. And I think it speaks to the Cipher brief's reach that you got the president to sort of do the concluding remarks for the morning on cyber issues. So they've gotten out in front of it. Now, partly that's out of fear, because they know that, you know, long gas lines, people angry about it, the first thing they're going to do is say, what is the government doing about this? And the fact of the matter is, Colonial is a private company, as are, you know, 80–85% of everybody else who runs critical infrastructure. And the U.S. government's got limited reach into what it is that they can go do there. The new cyber executive order is as far-reaching, I think, as it could be, but they're running up against the legal limits of what you can do with an executive order.
Excellent. Any final questions, Nick? I think I have grilled this fantastic New York Times correspondent enough today.
Well, I'll just make
fun, Nick, to be on the delivering end of questions like this and have to like take it from Suzanne and you.
the table's turned, David. No, just one comment. I mean, and then a question, and you can push back on the comment when I put the question. So you know that agencies are going to be very protective about their capabilities. So when they say we've pushed back, we're not telling you what we've done, you know there's a reason why they've done that. That's the comment. Do push back on that. The question, and in a way it's a comment as well, is I can't remember hearing a European politician referring to cyber threats, and that worries me. What do you think can be done to encourage European leaders, including, you know, we're still European in Britain, even though some people would like us not to be, including British leaders? What would you like to see politicians in Europe do just to spread a greater alertness about cyber threat?
Well, I have heard a few European leaders discuss it, but it's almost in passing, Nick. It's kind of like, you know, the list of things we've got to go deal with: climate, terrorism, oh yeah, cyber. Okay. The fact that President Biden has created a deputy national security advisor who just does cyber, and you know that's sort of the right, I think will begin to send a message out. The fact that this executive order has come out will begin to send a message out. But nothing sends a message out like losing your gas pipeline for a few days. And my guess is, and I'm sad to say it, is that the European countries where this is not moved to the center of the agenda, it won't until something like that happens. And that, I'm sorry to say that, but you know, we usually all respond to the last really bad thing that happened to us, right? So we spent trillions of dollars collectively after 9/11 shoring up all kinds of defenses, and unfortunately skewed our foreign policy in the United States and some in Europe as well, I think too far in the direction of terror threats. It's another issue. What I find just going around the country and to some degree other nations, because the perfect weapon's been translated into 7 or 8 languages, many of them, including European countries, is that people still regard cyber off to the side as like there's main conflict and there's cyber conflict. The way in the run-up to World War I, people viewed air power as something separate and thought there would be air wars and then, traditional war. And I've got a great book on my bookshelves published in Britain in 1908 or 1909 called something like Aeroplanes in Peace or War. And there's a great chapter in it that says, could London be bombed? Raising the question, could anybody actually get an airplane far enough to bomb London? Well, we answered the question before the second edition of the book came out. Okay. And that's kind of what we're seeing play out in cyber. What I think has not happened in Europe, and to some degree hasn't happened among many in the United States, because cyber is complicated and because people think it, involves issues that make them uncomfortable to go think about or are technological, is that cyber isn't the side act. It's now the central act, right? Nobody wants to take the US military or the British military on directly. So they're going to do attacks that they think fall just below those red lines that Suzanne and you were talking about before. And the result of that is that cyber is becoming the primary way that nation states and now criminal groups take it out on each other. And that has not seeped into the national consciousness yet in the United States or in Europe.
Yeah. David, I'd really like to thank you for being with us. I know that you are next turning to covering the president's remarks on cyber in just a few minutes. So we really appreciate you taking the time to kind of put this in a great perspective for us, but also help us think forward about what, alliances, how people need to think about working together and about what might be coming next. I think that's always a great intellectual exercise. So David, thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you, and good luck with the rest of the conference. And I look forward to the fact that now that we are all getting vaccinated and all that, that we may actually all, drink at Sea Island in the future.
That's right. October of this year, for those of you who are familiar, is a gathering of incredible experts to talk about these things in person. So we're grateful, like the rest of the world is, for a COVID vaccine, and we look forward to seeing you in person too, David.
Thanks. Take care.
Dave.